right, I want to welcome those who be seeing this video on YouTube, Moorhead Church of Christ, Wednesday Bible study. We are studying through the book of Judges. And one of the things I said in my introduction, when I talked about the fact that in Israel's history, this is considered the Dark Ages. This is really, we think about all the stuff with the kings, but this is really considered a time that really wasn't a good time for the nation of Israel. Really, it's a time before they really truly were a nation. They were just 12 tribes, and they weren't really together. They were together, but they didn't have a central leader. They had Moses, and Moses was gone before he left. He gave the baton to Joshua, and Joshua passed away, and now they're just sort of devoid of leadership. We basically have tribes sort of working independently, accomplishing various things, but it's really unimpressive time for the nation of Israel, and it's really a time where we see that they are going to digress, unfortunately, in terms of what God had intended for them.
I just have a quick question on the
Sure.
side. So, Moses died and then Joshua died. Do we ever hear about Caleb dying? Or, because my question would be, you would think he would be maybe the guy to lead them, because he was kind of...
Well, and it seemed like God was sort of choosing the leaders, and then after Joshua, there's really nobody that's sort of given the baton after them.
I mean,
and a lot of people, commentators sort of talk about that, trying to think about it. And what's been said is that, God, this is sort of what commentators sort of believe. God thought that they could operate as a people together if they followed God's law and they were loyal to Him. I mean, the idea that, since He doesn't pick a successor after Joshua, there has to be some kind of explanation, or, the idea is they're set up for failure. Well, they're not really set up for failure if they have God's law and they abide in God's law, and they essentially are, even though they're 12 tribes, they're still, part of this family of God's people. So,
well, Caleb wasn't chosen to be a leader like Moses. I mean, he helped, but like Moses and like Joshua, they were chosen vessels, directly from God.
Made sure.
So I think that's one of the reasons that that he falls off in the story. He gets to other leaders that stuff. So
right. So this is kind of where they're at, and from chapter 1, we realize because they essentially are failing to really do what God wanted to do. That one of the big things was that you're going to go in this land of milk and honey. You're essentially going to have everything supplied to you. You're going to have cities you didn't build. You're going to have vineyards you didn't plant. I mean, essentially, you're getting all of these things. And what we see is they were to drive out the occupants of the land. That becomes a big deal because the idea is these were wicked people. They're not going to be a good influence on you. God essentially gave you the green light to drive them out, and this lack of really desire to finish the job sort of becomes their undoing, and it's very tragic. And that's kind of what we're going to see throughout this book is limited success, but it's sort of like one step forward, two steps back. I mean, it's just very, very sad in that way. But there is just a wealth of information. We think about how valuable this book is. The idea, Paul talks about in Romans 15:4 about the things that are earlier written were written for our encouragement. So as bad as things are here, obviously we're God's people today. Obviously the Holy Spirit saw fit to preserve this history, and obviously it has some bearing and some relevance to our lives today. And we ought to look at it as such. We ought to not just sort of look at it as a historical account of God's people in the past and just leave it at that, but we ought to see the relevance for our lives today.
Which chapter are we in? 3?
We are in chapter 2. So we have already covered verses 1 through 9. So I am going to I want to reread 10, but Let's go ahead and divide the reading up here. If somebody'd like to read 10 through 16, okay, Ryan, and then somebody want to read 17 through 23? Jenna? Okay, thank you.
So 10 through 16. Okay. All that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals, and they forsook the Lord and the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord, and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers, who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, they had the hand of the Lord, or the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges, who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them.
And yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods, and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked, in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and delivered them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died, that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, and following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. And he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua.
All right, very good. So we're looking at this, and what I want us to see here is that it seemed like things went really well in verses 6 through 10. So this is like a flashback to Joshua 24, when it really sort of, the writer of this book sort of brings that into the picture. So this has already happened, and it sort of leaves off here with verse 10. So the idea is now we're going to get into sort of what happened after Joshua, after the elders and the generation at that time. It says in verse 10, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. And it really seems to be sort of a tragic place to be. And what we need to think about here in this really indictment against God's people is how can you have a nation that essentially has the great God of Israel and have all the experiences with God, and then you get a generation that does not know the Lord? How is it that they failed here? What happened?
Disobedience.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's true, but in what way?
Lack of teaching.
Okay, lack of teaching. So I want us to stop there and just kind of take a look at a couple verses before we move away from here. But I want us to look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we're going to read verses 10 and 11. Because this is really, Brother Ernest has brought out, this is really the trouble is that parents have an obligation to teach their children about God. Okay? I mean, this is going to be really the outcome here is there's a failure. It's a failure across the board. We're not talking about some parents failed, but it seems as if we have a whole generation of parents that have failed. Brother Brian, would you like to read
What was it, Deuteronomy what?
Deuteronomy chapter 4, and we want to read verses 10 and 11.
Okay. How on the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my word, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children so. And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain turned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud, and gloom.
Okay, very good. So I gave you 10 and 11. I meant to give you 9 too, but it says, in verse 9, only give heed to yourself to keep your soul diligent, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen. They do not depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and grandsons. And so the idea of verse 10 is that you're going to teach their children. If you turn ahead to chapter 6, we're talking about what is known as the Shema here in verse 4, which is sort of like the Israel's confession of faith. And in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 6 says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And then he says, verse 5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. You think about the prophet Samuel or the prophet Eli. Remember, the prophet Eli essentially was somebody who was sort of the spiritual leader of the nation, and yet his sons were evil. So he's essentially attending to the things of God. He's accomplishing all of these great things for God, and yet he was a terrible father because his sons, of course, were terrible priests. They were wanting to take something that they didn't deserve or shouldn't have had, and they were sleeping with the women that were maintaining the temple. Something happened, some kind of disconnect. And so the idea that just because the parents are faithful to God, there shouldn't be assumption made that the children are automatically, without being taught and taught about God and really provided example, that they're going to be faithful people of God.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so yeah, it's obviously that they weren't being taught,
disciplined.
Yeah, well, taught these, scriptures and stuff, but it also, I think it comes back to what we talked about in the chapter before, where they didn't drive the people out.
Right.
So you got these people and they have their gods and their
Right.
idols, and that's probably an influence where they're like, oh, what are they doing? And
Right.
it.
So the influence of these people may have had a bearing as far as why that didn't take place. Brother Timothy.
Yes, I was of you see, like these people, all of them, I would say, is utter failure on all the nation. How can a whole nation, nobody even remember the law God gave them to teach their children, and all of them just failed across board? Like, unlike, you see, when you compare to when God wanted to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, is at least he was able to find somebody who was faithful there. But here, nobody even lived up to expectation to keep the law, to teach them
Right.
their children. And this I was wondering, how can a whole nation, not even a family or a set of people now, a whole nation just
Right.
fail woefully in.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge sin, and it's widespread, and it really makes God's people look bad because they're obviously in violation of the law. Brother Ernest?
Yes, for a generation who's been with Moses, been with Joshua, seeing things, and then the next generation come about, obedience has turned into tradition. You know, this is the time of the Passover, but not really understanding anymore of what it is. It's just something that we do.
Right.
We go to the temple, this is what we do.
Right.
And that was so funny, because that was a question I asked the Sunday school class, and I was, you know, the basic question, and I wasn't putting them on the spot, but I said, not only you, but adults need to ask themselves this too. I say, you know, I basically asked them, with what's going on in the world, how many of you believe in God?
Right.
And they all raised their hand fast. But the next question was, if none of your parents was coming to church, would you believe? And all of them were hesitant.
All of them, they didn't ever raise their hand. They realized there was a direct connection to that. Yeah.
And I was just saying, and I said, why do you believe in God? They were like, well, we come to church every Sunday. It's a tradition.
Yeah.
But I was letting them know, you have to learn your own faith.
Right.
You have to learn your own dedication.
Right.
You know, it's good that you're being brought.
Right. You know, it's good that your parents have faith in God, but you got to have your own faith, not because they believe. You have to believe because you have the conviction of truth. Yeah.
So it's like, you know, they know Sunday week we go to church, but it's not, we're going for worship. We're going to please God. I'm going because I go. So I believe, but you know, their foundations is still trying to be solid, trying to be set. So
well, those are the kind of questions they need, and really be challenged on. Why do you come? And if it's, well, because my parents bring me, you got a lot of work to do. I mean, it should be like, we come because God wants to be worshiped. We come because we're honoring God and remembering His Son. All those things, those should come out. And if they got a handle on that, that's going to really change their mindset about when they're here versus, you know, I come because my parents bring me. Yeah.
It feels like Samuel was hypocritical if he didn't discipline his sons like he's supposed to.
Yeah. Well, something happened, and maybe, you know, like we think about Eli, something happened in terms of maybe he was thinking, this is more important than this. And maybe he made an assumption that a lot of parents do today, Christian parents.
He knew better than that.
Well, you know, maybe he makes the assumption, a lot of Christian parents is, I just need to focus on being a faithful follower of the Lord, take my children to the church, and the rest will take care of itself. But it doesn't. Because faith has to be something that's taught.
God's not teaching us officially when you say something like that, because God would convict him. You know, you need to discipline your children.
Right.
As you're doing my job, your kids are out of line here. You're not taking them to church. You're not teaching them in my word. Raise your children up in the Lord, and they will not depart.
Right.
And stuff. So we can't say that because God is perfect. God teaches us what all of our responsibilities are, what we're to do, and He'll give us the strength and the knowledge to do that.
Right. So you think about what it says in the New Testament, Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4, we're supposed to bring your children up in the discipline and the admonition of the Lord. So that's a pretty heavy responsibility. You think, well, there's a lot of responsibility in being parents. You got to make sure you can provide for them. You got to, you know, care for them. You know, they can't. There's a lot of responsibility, but it's probably, as parents, it's one of the great responsibilities is, you know, you essentially have to prepare them for life's road once they leave your home. They've got to have a foundation. They have to really have, you know, a belief in God and understand why when you ask a child and the only answer they have is we go to church because our parents bring us, that's a terrible response. That means something's missing, some kind of lack of understanding, and that has to be communicated by the parents. And maybe they do that as like, you know, if the parents are always saying, well, come on, we got to get up, we have to go to church today, this is where that comes from. And maybe by essentially saying, you know, we got to get up today. Today is the day we're going to worship God. Think about how that comes across. And maybe just by making some of those changes, we have the opportunity to worship God and the responsibility. By just making some changes and talking about those things in a different light can make a lot
Well,
of
the
difference.
children of Israel, because if they seen him not raising his children right, this could be a stumbling block for them too,
Right?
and stuff. So that's, we've got, just like the church, we've got to make sure that we present ourselves Christly
Sure.
and, well controlled and stuff.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and so one of the things that we hear, and I've heard it a number of times, is that the church is only one generation from apostasy. Anyone else has ever heard that? The church is only one generation from apostasy? Okay, and really what it means is that our children in the church are our future, and we're the ones that are going to be handing the baton to them. And if we don't do our job as parents and as the church, giving our children a well-rounded spiritual education, the church is in trouble, big trouble, because what happened here is going to happen to God's people in the next generation. So it is a pretty serious responsibility, and so we can sort of see what happens when the generation that raised them failed. I mean, we're going to read what happened, and essentially, they went off into sin. And they had such a rich history. When you go back and you look at it, it's like Abraham, God calling Abraham, bringing him to, into the Palestine area, promising him this land, giving him a son, and all of these children, and God bringing him out by the 10 plagues, and opening the Red Sea, and bringing him through the wilderness. All of this stuff to get to this point. Even after Joshua conquering many of the peoples there. So let's get into the text here. Verse 11 says, "Then that the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals," or Baals as they're called. So without proper spiritual direction, the idea is God's people are in trouble here. And so we want to think about, the Baals or the Baals here. So these are really talking about pagan gods. So I have a lot of information, but I don't want to go through all of it. What I want to do is just sort of explain to you that this is really the key deity in the Palestine region is Baal. In fact, as you're reading through the Old Testament, you're going to hear of names of places like Baal of Peor or some other designation like that. That's really the influence that this pagan deities had over this area. Okay, so obviously these pagan gods are part of what the occupants of Canaan's land worship. The word Baal means Lord or Master, and the word Baal became identified with various regional gods that were thought to provide fertility for crops and livestock. As a god who symbolized productive forces of nature, Baal was worshipped with much sensuality. So we won't go to all these passages, Numbers 22:41, 1 Kings 16:31-32. Baal was considered the god who brought rain and fertility, especially good harvests, and animal reproduction. And so I just got a ton of information. This is all from International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. But obviously this is a major Canaan deity, and so the question that we have as God's people, they read that, and it's disappointing and it's sad. You're like, how stupid that is to worship something that doesn't exist. How stupid it is to worship something that can never help you, that can never do anything for you, and yet all of this energy has been put into worshiping this particular god. Of course, this is idolatry. Idolatry is really about substituting really the real God with an alternative God. And so the idea is it's not that Israel lacked a God, it's just that he's essentially being replaced with the gods of that region that are really talked up by those remaining Canaanites in the land, and say, well, if you want to have fertile crops, you have to worship Baal. If you want this, you're going to have to worship this God. This is how essentially we get the blessings. And you think God's people would say, that's dumb. These are made out of stone. They're made out of wood. They can't do anything for you. You think God's people would be smarter than that, and yet we recognize they're a product of the ungodly community in which they live.
It makes me think that, like, imagine if the Israelites did get rid of all those leftover people there, they probably wouldn't have even had
Right.
much of an issue. 'Cause
So they've created their own
Yeah.
problem by disobeying God. You think about that. Do we do that today? If we're not faithful to the word, do we create problems in our life that essentially can sort of be our undoing? Of course it is. And so the idea of, and this is what Moses stressed to the Israelites in Deuteronomy is make sure you're doing the law. Make sure you're keeping God's words, His commands. Make sure you get rid of, these occupants. Make sure it's not as if they didn't know what to do. They just didn't seem committed to doing what God. So the idea is they became unfaithful to the teachings that they were given, the commandments, when they started worshiping these idols. Because once they started worshiping the idols, then everything else sort of was neglected as well, because they started serving the idols instead of God. So it's a terrible, terrible circumstance.
Well, today, people, that could still, not that, but, in Israel here today, God could punish for disobedience. What is the father that don't chastise the child? God chastises us when we're disobedient. And
Sure.
we've seen that. I've seen that in my life too, and I'm a witness to it. And he's seen it too,
Yes.
and stuff. And we've got to remember, disobedience
Right.
causes detrimental destruction.
Right. Well, you're basically lose God's blessings, and you're inviting
You have no protection.
troubles into your life because you're not doing what you should be. Yeah. So let's go to verse 12 there. It says, and they forsook, the idea of sort of quitting or abandoning the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them, and thus they provoked the Lord to anger. And so the idea is that God had right to the people of Israel. Remember, we talked about covenant last time. They entered a covenant with God, and a covenant is not like a contract where it's a short period of time or a temporary period of time is over. It's just like a lifetime commitment. So they essentially do the unthinkable. You entered in a covenant with God. Now you're worshiping these other gods, and guess what it's done to God? It says it's provoked him to anger because he expects covenant loyalty. In other words, I'm being loyal to you, and I'm essentially giving you the things I promised would give you. When you obey me, I bless you. He goes over this, and Moses goes over this, the idea of blessings or cursings. The idea is if you do what you're supposed to do, as I command you to do, I'm going to bless you in all these different ways. And if you disobey me, then you're going to essentially receive really, curses, because you're doing what you shouldn't be doing. And so really they're responsible by their disobedience to provoking the Lord to anger, which is an interesting thought. The idea of when we disobey God, we provoke him to anger. We should essentially be more mindful of what we do so that we don't sin, because God hates sin. We don't want to provoke the one who has given us salvation and that we entered into a covenant with as well.
Well, John 1 says we don't love God if we habitually sin.
Yeah, it says
And
if you're in darkness, walk in darkness, you lie and don't tell the truth.
Yeah.
It's a good verse. Verse 13, talking about these Israelites, it says, so they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. And Ashtaroth is the plural form of Ashtoreth. And Ashtoreth is a pagan goddess. 1 Samuel 31:10 connects her with the Philistines, so it's a god that they worshipped. Also connects him with the Sidonians. And Ashtoreth was considered the companion or partner of the male god Baal. So this is sort of the female sort of equivalent. Any questions about verse 13? About
add to this disobedience from the scripture.
Okay, verse 14, it says, "And the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of the plunderers, who plundered them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies." Now, this is really telling us in advance what's going to unfold throughout the course of the book of Judges. We're going to read about that. We're going to read about what they were doing, and we're going to see God sort of just, removes the protection, raises up their enemy, and essentially they fall into the hands of their enemies because of their own disobedience. And so the idea of God's anger sort of burning, the idea is that this is really indignation or God's displeasure of something that God considers unjust or unrighteous. And it's really insulting to God. And so they are going to suffer for their wickedness. Verse 15, it says, "Whatever they went, or wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed." Now, we're going to have a little bit of a challenge here in this word here, because there are a lot of people that like to pounce on certain things said in the Bible and say, "Oh, I thought God was light," and 1 John 1:5, there's no darkness in him. And what do we have here? It says that the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. Well, is that a Bible contradiction? So how would we explain that?
If you're doing evil, the hand of the Lord is against you.
Well, I know, but it says here that it says the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. And what I'm saying is how would we essentially explain this to somebody who wants to find fault with God? Right?
I think it would go back to verse 14,
Okay.
where God allowed them to
Okay.
be plundered and eventually taken over by these other, even though these other nations were, worse in a lot of respects. It kind of, he used it to kind of, punish them and train them. This is what happens when you go against my will.
Okay.
I allow these other idolatry, idols and everything, countries that serve all these idols to rise up and have their time in the sun until you guys snap out of it, and then we put them back in their place.
Okay, so that would be an excellent way. The idea is, so let's look at the context. If we look at the context, it's going to help us with the word. When we isolate this verse, and you have the critic come and say, "I thought God wasn't, evil. I thought he was only good." When you isolate a verse like this and you don't consider the context, you're going to make it say something altogether different. Now, this word evil, a lot of times we find in Scripture, sort of really talks about ethical evil. Okay, so when you go back up to verse 11, when it says the sons of Israel did evil, that's what it's talking about. We're talking about ethical evil. They violated God's law, did things that God didn't want them to do. But this word is not evil in that sense. There's another. The word means, can have different meanings, and so it can talk about ethical evil, or it could talk about essentially in a different sense, and really the word means distress or adversity or calamity. And so here it's used in a different way, in which the idea is God essentially allows these things, he punishes them, the idea for discipline, for the purpose really of repentance and restoration. He is not committing any kind of injustice upon them. He's not doing anything evil to them in the ethical sense. He's simply allowing them to go through adversity and calamity for the purpose of turning them around. In other words, we keep reading this is exactly what's going to happen. So what you brought out is a great point. Now, let's just consider the context. Let's not just try to go with the word right here, because it leads you to the wrong understanding. And of course, the psalmist writes in Psalm 145 and verse 17 that God is good. He does, everything he does good. That he's kind and all that. And so, obviously, the way that it's being applied is applied different. Some translations use different words because you seize upon a word. It's like the word jealous. We understand what jealous said. She's jealous of him, or he's jealous of, of somebody else or whatever. We always take it in sort of that negative sense. And then when it's used about God, it says God is jealous, it's talking about it in a different sense in terms of covenant loyalty. So we cannot sort of just think that that one meaning has to be used all the way across the board, because it can't be used that way in relation to God. God's not jealous like we're jealous. He essentially wants covenant loyalty. And the same thing with evil here, the idea that he is going to allow them to go through adversity and calamity for the purpose of getting their attention and recognizing that they are not faithful to him, and they're going to essentially suffer as a result of it. Not because he wants to really hurt them, but he wants them to come to repentance, because they're wrong. They're doing the wrong thing. And if he really was wanting to see them, he didn't really care about them, he would essentially just destroy them in the instant. He's given them a chance to turn things around. Okay?
I've got something here. Every thought and every word produces a seed. Something so long as there is wait a minute. Every thought and word is a seed, produces something. So long as there is a disease in your thoughts, there will be a disease in your body. Luke 12 verse 2. Nothing is covered up that it will not be revealed, or hidden that it won't be known. So
okay.
we've got to, thoughts start in the mind. Sin, that's how it produces and
Right.
stuff in the mind, and we've got to root it out. We have good thoughts.
Sure.
Like you said before, think good things when negativity comes in our life.
Okay. Let's pick up and. Did you have something, brother?
Yeah, can we also say that Israel, in a sense, is at that time, go along and get along with their neighbors and
Right.
kind of fearful, and like how your sermon was Sunday about who cares,
Yeah.
if we're Christian, stand firm,
Yeah.
instead of just being quiet and, just fitting in, and,
Right.
I'm not doing that, but
Right.
you don't stand out, you know what I mean? Is
Yeah.
that something that can, over a generation, not teaching against so hard, like, well, this is what we do, but
Right.
you don't shun what you shouldn't really do so hard.
Right.
Is that in play as we're looking at, the next generation, like they didn't stand firm, like, I ain't gonna say less obedience, but it's less, what's the word I'm looking for?
Less committed?
Yes,
Okay.
like.
Yeah. No, those are good. And in other places in the Old Testament, it talks about the fact that the Israelites were actually curious about the gods that they served. Why would you be curious about the fact that these people are worshiping things that aren't real? Why wouldn't you just sort of have a sense of pride and say, our God is the one that, God gave us water from a rock and made food fall from the sky? Why would you be remotely curious about, all these other pagan deities that people around you had? And this really shows the real problem by not driving them out. This is sort of, as the Bible writer always said, it was like a thorn in their side. You created your own mess here. You created your own hardship here, because obviously there was no good point in leaving them in the land. And it's just really tragic when we sort of think about what could have been.
Choices have
What could have been if
repercussions.
they would have got everything together and did exactly what God wanted them to do. But it really seems to be a history, sort of God's people sort of failing.
I was gonna say, they are even instructed on the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not serve
Yeah.
the other gods, and here they are, like you said, they're curious about this other one. It's like, man, that's a basic knowledge on
Right.
the
Right.
10 Commandments.
I don't know, was it flash? Was
Yeah.
it like, we see our 10 Commandments on stone, but they got a golden calf God, like shiny.
Wow, look at that. Well, see, and I think
Yeah.
the idea that you can actually see, and that's the whole thing, is something tangible. In other words, where's your God? You don't have anything. Well, our God's in heaven. We don't, But I mean, the idea that you would actually have some kind of representation, and that's really what the Ten Commandments are getting. The idea that you're not even supposed to make any kind of representation. Your God is not that kind of God that essentially has a material form. Your God is a God that cannot be contained by the heavens or the earth. I mean, he is this incredible God, the sovereign God, all-powerful God, and you think, why didn't they get that? Why didn't they understand that? But I mean, it's just sort of like, they struggled with that. The idea that they've got these piddly gods set up on stands and you're worshiping them. Why didn't that sink in? What is that? But, before we get too hard on them, we would say to Christians, why would Christians leave the church and think they're going to be better off in the world? How is that? So we can really come down hard on them and sometimes sort of say, there's Christians today, they have their sins forgiven, they got a crown of life, they leave it all behind, and they go back to the world. What in the world is going to give you anything remotely close to what you're giving up? You're giving up so much that it's never going to be worth it. And that's really the real tragedy. And I think that's something we ought to see in this, is the idea is we can play armchair quarterback and look at them and really just say, well, you guys are really dumb and fail that, the devil's never going to give up today, and the devil is obviously going to try to fool us and try to sort of bring us into thinking, we should fit in with the society around us.
I think.
Give Brother Ernest a chance
Not
here.
to waste time
That's okay.
or to beat them up. That's the last thing I'm trying to do. Because when I think about the Bible, the most, I ain't gonna say insane, because it's true, but what I just can't grapple with, and this is the sinful nature of man that we can't underestimate,
Right,
is the generation that came out of Egypt,
right,
that went through the sea on dry land.
yeah,
And then Moses went to the mountain and they built their own calf and they walked
yeah.
on dry
That's just so
land.
hard to understand that.
And that wasn't generations, that was the actual people that saw it, the
Yeah.
waters part.
Yeah,
As soon as Moses left them, they built a golden
Yeah.
calf. So I'm not beating them up.
no, but I mean, what I meant by that is we shouldn't think that, we're in a much better place than they are today. We would never make those kind of mistakes today, and obviously we can make terrible mistakes too if we're not careful, but we have just a wealth of information, of all this being preserved for us, so it stands out so clearly to us that we're like, how could you guys do that? What were you thinking? And you're thinking, Aaron, hello, you're like, you're like the high priest. Well, why didn't you say something?
Exactly.
And all he did was make excuses. Well, the people, yeah, okay, well, you're the high priest. The high priest of who? Not of the golden calf. Yeah, it's hard to believe. It is really hard to believe. Okay,
I want to draw a thing right here. We see choices, what choices does. After you do them, Israel straightened out,
right?
and God saved them. But you see over the years of the choices they made, detrimental,
Right.
It's hard to get away from your bed. When you harden your heart for so long, even though you go to church, you come back, you still have problems.
Right.
And stuff. And sin makes a pattern that it's hard to escape. And we see that with Israel. They got saved, but they went back to worshiping fake gods time after time.
Right.
And we can see that, a person that stays in sin, and keeps choosing to live in this kind of lifestyle and rebellion towards God,
Right.
it takes a long time to overcome, and it takes you harder to stay out of that sin.
Yep.
So that's why you need to try earnestly to be obedient, because it says in Scripture that He yearns over the Spirit.
Yeah.
And stuff, and the Spirit that we've been given, we've been given that to guide us,
Right.
to be, to use it wisely, not
Right.
ignorantly.
Yeah, and so we're about out of time, but what we want to think about here is that this is going to be a habitual problem. This is what makes this book so hard when you look at it. Say, how could you have failures after failures after failures? Like, they'd have a deliverer, they'd get free from their oppressors, and then they'd slip back into sin, and then they'd be oppressed again. And the idea is, you know, this is a cycle. And the only way you break that cycle is if you stay at the top and you remain faithful to God. And when you get away from God, all kinds of bad things happen. But in some ways, I think they were blessed by the fact that God allowed these things in their life, because he is essentially getting their attention and getting them to say things aren't what they should be. And I think, you know, how deceptive the evil one is with sin. The idea is if we allow sin in our life, we can get comfortable with sin, and maybe we'll never reemerge from sin, because we tend to downplay sin, and the longer we allow sin in our life, the more it gets entrenched, and our conscience becomes really seared as a result of the fact that we've allowed sin in our life. So, you know, I think there's just abundance of information when we sort of look at what they did and look at our lives today and say, how can we essentially benefit in a positive way from all of the negative things that they did? And I think it challenges us not to just sort of see how bad they were in terms of being followers of God, but it should be like a spiritual mirror for ourselves and say, you know, how committed are we to, you know, the things of God, not allowing anything else to come before God. Nothing else can be that idol that's more important to us than God. So it's about all the time that we have. It's been fun, but it's
been productive tonight.
It's done. So we're gonna stop there. I want to thank those who will see the video here. Hopefully it'll be encouraging to you, and God willing, a week from today we'll have another video then.